Last year during my winter break, I was returning to my home in northern Pakistan. It's very much the most tribal area of our country, as most of the area is oppressed by bandits and street gangs with almost no assistance from local law enforcement. My 3 cousins and I decided to spend our vacation at a friend's place. Our friend was an older man who owned a farm in a secluded area, about 50 miles away from most of the populated locations. The farmhouse was at the top of the hill, and the property was surrounded by a metal fence, with a gate at the entrance. There was one way up and one way down, and once the gate closed behind us, we immediately felt a sense of total security. None of the gangs that terrorized the cities would waste their time trespassing up here, and it didn't hurt that there was about 8 dogs that lived in the farmhouse as well. We arrived at about 10 p.m. Once our friend who owned the place greeted us, we quickly visited the dogs. They were all closed off on one side of the house, and shortly after we began to smoke some hash. The 4 of us hung out in one of the upstairs rooms and just smoked the night away, talking way louder than was necessary and laughing our asses off. At about 2 a.m., I got up and left the room to go make us some food downstairs. One of my cousins came with me. As we descended the stairs, we heard dogs barking from across the house. I was about to ask my cousin what he felt like cooking when the power suddenly went out. We both froze on the stairs. Aside from the dogs barking, we couldn't hear anything. We called out for our friend who owned the property, but we got no response. We hadn't expected him to. He said he was heading to bed after we arrived. In the pitch darkness, my cousin and I walked to the far side of the house, across the area where the dogs were kept. Most of them were leaping up and barking like crazy. We then made our way to the circuit breaker. I raised my phone's light to the breaker and discovered the switch had been flipped. Someone had physically shut off the power. I flipped the switch back and called for our friend again. Still no answer. My cousin gave me a confused look. We didn't understand. The 4 of us had been upstairs. Had our friend planned to shut off the power, he would have warned us. The dogs were literally right there at our feet, scrambling around. They were acting a bit more frantic than usual, but we figured it was because we were visiting, and they weren't used to the extra company. At just after 3 a.m., the 4 of us were still eating and smoking, but I was ready to get some sleep. Right as I was lying down and getting comfortable, I heard the dogs start going nuts again. Then the power went out for a second time. I sat back up and called to my cousins in the dark. I told them all to turn on their phones because we were heading downstairs. Now at this point we were all incredibly lit, so we weren't exactly being stealthy and silent as we made our way across the hall and down the stairs, bumping into each other every other step. Before we got to the ground floor, the power came back on again. The dogs sounded like they were trying to break through the wall. I made a beeline for the office and grabbed a rifle from where it hung over the mantel. My cousins took 3 other guns from the cabinet and we charged outside like a bunch of stoned morons. It then started to rain, but we swept the perimeter of the house and scanned the property in all directions. No sign of anyone, and no signs of a break-in. One of my cousins suggested letting the dogs out, but I declined, stating that if we let them run wild in the dark, we would spend the rest of the night trying to catch them again. We went back inside and set the guns down. As we headed back upstairs, I was trying to convince myself that the second power outage had been a fluke and not deliberate. We checked on our friend who owned the property by peeking inside his room, but he was sound asleep despite all the noise the dogs were making. We had just got back to our room, and were about to try and get some sleep when the power went out for a 3rd time. By this point, I was frustrated. I tore down the stairs and ran through the hallway in the direction of the dog's room. That's when I heard the faintest sound of what I can only describe as a deep chuckle coming from my left. I paused and pointed my phone's flashlight through the doorway. Across the room, through the window, I could see a face staring back inside at me. I didn't see it very clearly. It was pretty dark, but I distinctly remember seeing the outline of a figure with its face pressed to the glass. I called out in panic and dropped my phone as I took a step back. My cousins had caught up with me at that point, but when I raised the phone again, there was nothing staring at us through the window. I crossed the house, threw open the door, and let all the dogs out. They tore across the dark yard, barking and snarling. I grabbed the rifle again and ran outside after them. My cousins followed right behind me, each yelling at me to slow down and asking me what I saw. As I turned the corner and aimed the rifle, I could faintly make out through the darkness that the dogs had gathered around something and were barking in a frenzy, but it wasn't furious barking, it sounded panicked. There was a figure almost gliding across the yard, completely unbothered by the dogs. It was making its way towards the fence. My cousins all pointed their phones, and in the faint light of the screens I saw the figure turn and look towards us. I don't recall seeing a full face. I only remember catching a glimpse of pitch black, empty eye sockets. My cousins all screamed and took off. I squeezed the trigger of the gun, but in my haste, I had forgotten to remove the safety. In a blind panic, I dropped the rifle and ran after them. We didn't go back inside. We went directly to the car, abandoning all of our things. I put the key in the ignition and we floored it to the end of the driveway. My cousin in the front seat leapt out to quickly open the gate. Once he was back inside the car, he screamed that it was coming after us, and I floored it down the hill and away from the house. In the back seat, my two other cousins were freaking out, screaming that it was still behind us. So I drove like a madman down the hill at breakneck speed, but no matter how fast I went, they claimed that it was still behind us. It was a miracle that we didn't wreck and end up in a ditch. We drove until we got to the first well-lit parking lot. We then swung in there and parked, and tried to catch our breath. It began to sink in what we had just done. We had abandoned our friend, asleep in a pitch-black house with all the dogs loose in the yard, and the gate wide open. My cousins were all screaming incoherently, and I was just about to suggest that we go back, when I saw it. Across the parking lot, a figure was walking towards us, and it was dragging something behind it. I didn't bother to look twice. I floored it out of the parking lot and down the street. We drove until we were clear across town. We stopped again and tried to call the farmhouse, but we didn't get an answer. I never went back. One of my cousins felt guilty enough to try to contact the police, but there was never any follow-up from them. That same cousin eventually returned to the property to collect our things. When he got back, he told us that there was no sign of the dogs or our friend, even though his truck was still parked outside of the house. This all took place about a year ago, and we still don't know what happened to him. The most likely scenario is that someone tried to burglarize the place, and there was a confrontation, though how it ended is anyone's guess. My cousins and I all acknowledged that we were pretty high that night, but we all know that we didn't hallucinate when we saw that thing gliding across the yard, with the dogs hesitating, keeping just far enough away from it to avoid making contact. We all witnessed the same thing, a dark figure without any eyes, looking over towards us. What bothers me even more is what my cousins said they saw from the car. I only caught a glimpse of something being dragged, but my cousins told me the thing was an animal head, perhaps one of the dogs. I didn't see it, but I hope that's really what it was, because if it wasn't a dog's head, it might have just been the head of our missing friend. Well over a decade ago, I used to work as a security guard at the Dade City Business Center in Florida. It was essentially a cluster of various facilities in a single plaza, and it was a pretty busy place during the day. As part of the security team, we had to constantly check all the workers and trucks from the different companies that operated there as they came and went. There was 3 main positions: the check-in station, rover patrol, and the warehouse foot patrol. I have had the pleasure of working all 3 at one time or another, but I was usually assigned to foot patrol. On Friday nights from 5 p.m. to 5 a.m., I had the job of checking all the doors to the warehouses located in the back of the plaza. The rover patrol couldn't cover these areas because they were inaccessible to any type of vehicle. Most of these areas were decommissioned or abandoned. So for reference, one lonesome security putz would have to walk around a neglected back alley area close to complete darkness and hope you wouldn't encounter any trouble. I was being paid minimum wage at the time, so I wasn't looking to exert myself more than I had to. Along the far end of the plaza were functioning railroad tracks, and occasionally the train horn would sound and would come tearing by, jolting everyone on security from our dreary autopilot trances and snap us back into reality. We would take turns spewing profanities at the train and making each other laugh over the radios. We would also get to talking about the creepy sightings that would occur around the tracks. Apparently, staff around the plaza would sometimes report sightings of a young girl in a white dress, walking or floating down the tracks, always in the direction of the nearby cemetery. She would never respond to anything that was shouted at her. There wasn't many security cameras around the abandoned area of the lot, where most of these sightings would take place, so to my knowledge she was never captured on film. My superiors who trained me all swore by it. Real hard-working, tough-as-nails guys with no senses of humor at all. Both the business center and Dade City itself have reputations for being associated with supernatural encounters. There's quite a bit of history to the town that you can easily look up with a simple Google search. I'm not going to get into all that right now, but just keep in mind that most history does not illustrate humanity's good nature. Now that I've set the mood, let's get into one of the most terrifying experiences I've ever had working there. It was a hot summer night in July of 2007. As per usual, I was working foot patrol, 12 long, exhausting hours of walking around and checking knobs. Not much to it, to be honest, and at least all the walking was good for my figure. In my time working there, I had experienced my share of mildly bizarre occurrences. The feeling of being watched, the temperature suddenly becoming inexplicably cold. I'm sure you all know the type of thing I'm talking about. But after a while, these things become mundane, for lack of a better word, and the wow factor gets diminished. It was around midnight when my routine took me to the aluminum plant. Unlike the other warehouses, there was slightly more involved to securing this structure than just checking doors. There was various machinery left on in the back of the warehouse, and part of my responsibility was to check some of the readouts on the consoles and make sure the numbers were being displayed between a certain range. And if they weren't, I would have to make some phone calls. To get to these consoles, you had to take some metal stairs to the second floor, which led to a walkway where you could check the numbers. And right after the last console, there would be another set of stairs that you could take to exit back down. I was idly walking by each console, glancing at each display, showing no enthusiasm as I was so lost in my routine. As I got to the end of the walkway, I made to walk down the far staircase when I paused. For a split second, I got that being watched feeling, and I glanced behind me down the way I came. For me to say that there was someone standing there would be oversimplifying it. The first thing that entered my head was that someone had simply appeared there. A woman in a white nightgown was about 10 feet away from me, looking directly at me. Yes, there was some machinery running, but even moving slowly and carefully down that walkway is almost impossible without making noise. I didn't hear a single thing to indicate that there was anyone there. I stood dead still for a few heartbeats. There wasn't much light up there on the walkway. There was just the faint glow from the display screens. I could see her outline and part of her face, but the shadows casted by her hair prevented me from seeing her eyes. I had my mag light on my belt, but the idea of reaching down and grabbing it, lifting it, and turning it on seemed way too daunting in that moment. I don't recall if the woman moved closer, but I definitely felt like she was closing in on me. I was just about to say something out loud when the woman raised her left hand and grabbed the left side of her face under her hair. She tilted her head sideways slowly, and then lifted it right off her neck. This wasn't an optical illusion because of the darkness. It wasn't a trick. I saw her arm straighten, and the woman's head was lifted directly off her torso. I sprinted down the stairs and tore out of the building. I didn't scream or anything. I just ran. I kept running until I was at the complete opposite end of the plaza. It was then I finally stopped to catch my breath. I leaned against the wall in the dark and tried to process what had just happened. The entire encounter had maybe lasted about 15 seconds, and there was a part of my brain trying to dismiss it as a prank. But the harder I tried to rationalize it, the more I began to panic. Aside from me and the other security guards, no one was supposed to have access to that building this time of night. There was no way I would have gone back there again that night. I continued on with my shift, feeling extremely vulnerable, like I was being hunted. I made up some bullshit excuse about having a family emergency and left early. I think my shocked expression helped make my story more believable to my supervisors. I never told anyone about what I saw, not my closest friends or coworkers. I was worried that they would think I was delusional or lying. I eventually returned to work after a while and went back into the routine. I never saw the mysterious figure again. In 2010, the year after I left, a citrus processing plant located in the center caught fire and nearly burned to the ground. Remember how I said that the train tracks ran through the entire plaza? Well, I forgot to mention that there was no safety arm that came down when the trains would pass through at full speed. In June of 2016, a train smashed into a semi-truck that was crossing the tracks at the wrong time. I'm sure these occurrences aren't connected, but still, it makes you wonder.